Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Medicare Monday with Indiana SHIP, the State Health Insurance Assistance Program. I'm Susan in Indianapolis, and I am joined by my co-hostess, Megan Rogers in Northern Indiana.
Morning, Susan.
And our special guest today is Dennis Frick. And Dennis is the director of the Senior Law Project in Indiana Legal Services. And Dennis is going to make sure that we all understand all the facets of Medicaid, or maybe not all, maybe just some. But we appreciate you being here, Dennis. And just as a reminder to people who are joining us, Dennis is open to questions. So if you have questions about Medicaid, just put them in the chat, or you can contact Megan or me if you have that information. Or, if you're watching this as a recording, you can also ask questions and we will monitor those. And then it'll be up for a month. And then we'll get with Dennis and answer your questions there on our Facebook page. It'll be shown on our Facebook page for 30 days. Facebook then takes it down, but then it'll go to our YouTube channel where it will remain. So ask us questions about Medicaid, just ask away. So, Dennis, first of all, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And first of all, I'd like to know, what is the Senior Law Project and how does it fit in Indiana Legal Services?
So Indiana Legal Services is a statewide, not-for-profit law firm in Indiana, primarily federally funded, and we receive funding to provide legal assistance to low-income persons throughout Indiana. And the program does receive grants from other places such as United Way, but primarily federally funded. The Senior Law Project is a special project within Indiana Legal Services in the Indianapolis office. We receive some additional funding under the Older Americans Act to provide legal assistance to persons age 60 and above in a lot of we cover a broad area within central Indiana out of our office here. We also receive funding to provide ombudsman services to nursing home residents and residents in licensed assisted living facilities to help them deal with quality of care issues. But the Senior Law Project on the legal side provide assistance in a variety of civil matters, not any criminal matters. Persons can contact us to request assistance. They can either request assistance online at www.indianalegalservices.org, or they can telephone the Indiana Legal Services Central Intake toll-free number at 844-243-8570. And we have staff available Mondays through Thursdays between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. to take their calls for assistance. And at least in the counties served out of our Senior Law Project Indianapolis office, for anybody over age 60, those will get routed to my project to consider those requests for assistance. We also do outreach at various senior centers kind of around central Indiana too.
So what happens with people who don't live in central Indiana? Is there a senior law project if they live in, say, southern Indiana?
So it kind of varies. I mean, anybody that is welcome to contact Indiana Legal Services, and our staff will help them determine if they are eligible for assistance. Many of our other offices, well, we have 8 offices throughout Indiana. Some of our other offices also receive grants. Basically, the federal funding under the Old Americans Act flows to the state and then down to the localities through the area aging agencies. And many of the area aging agencies in Indiana do contract with Indiana Legal Services to provide assistance to seniors. There are a few AAAs in Indiana that contract maybe with a local private attorney, not with us. But even if we do not have a special grant in that area, if the person meets the regular financial eligibility criteria for Indiana Legal Services, then we can still potentially assist them. When we have, for instance, in our project under the Older Americans Act, we have more flexibility. We have more flexibility to kind of work with people even if they're above the regular income or asset guidelines for assistance from Indiana Legal Services.
Right, because the Older Americans Act is for people 60 years old and older, right?
Yes,
Not necessarily the lower income folks.
right.
Okay. But speaking of lower income folks, let's talk about Medicaid. So to make sure that people are understanding, Medicaid is not Medicare. So give us the quick definition of Medicaid.
So Medicaid, I tell my clients Medicaid is a public assistance program. So it typically does have financial eligibility criteria. It is a joint program between the federal government and the state. So the federal government puts in um, the biggest percentage of the funding for the programs, but what makes it complicated is that the federal law gives states lots of options. So Indiana has chosen various options. So Medicaid in Indiana will look different than Medicaid in any other state, whereas Medicare is essentially the same program nationwide. May get it gets entered it Medicare is administered by local contractors. There may be some small variations in some administration, but basically Medicaid is very different from state to state. Some things will be similar, some things will be different. What makes Medicaid complicated too is that over the years, there are lots of different categories of Medicaid there's categories for children, there's categories for pregnant women. In Indiana, there's the Healthy Indiana program that's for persons basically between 19 and 65 who don't have other health insurance. And we're probably more interested in the programs that apply to the aged and to the disabled because that kind of also ties into the Medicare population. And those are the programs that I spend more of my time working with. So, I mean, there are somewhere, it kind of depends on how you count them, but there's basically like roughly about 40 categories of Medicaid in Indiana. So it gets really complicated. But we'll focus on those programs that work for seniors, that apply to seniors and the disabled.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, wow, 40. I knew there were many, but I didn't know. Wow. Um, okay, so we know that Medicaid, to be eligible for Medicaid, you have to meet income and asset eligibility requirements. And correct me if I'm wrong, but for those 40 programs, are there 40 different criteria?
There do tend to be, they do vary from program to program. And you mentioned the income and asset rules. There actually are now most of the program categories that apply to the seniors and disabled do have asset limits, but there are several categories, particularly the programs for the children, and then the Healthy Indiana plan that does not have an asset limit. So we seem to have been at one point in time kind of moving away from asset limits, but that's not the case for the aged and disabled programs.
Right, which we think is unfortunate. Um, well, let's talk about income. So if we're looking at Medicaid for older adults and people with disabilities, the aged and disabled group of people, what do they consider as income? What does income mean?
So the simple definition is kind of, what comes in, and I typically think of it on a monthly basis, and they refer to unearned income and earned income. So to distinguish, when you take money out of a bank account, you're not receiving income for that. You're just converting what, and To make things more confusing, rather than using the word asset, Medicaid refers to resource limits. But resources, when they talk about resources, they're really talking about assets. So when you take money out of your savings account, you're not receiving income. You're just converting a resource from to a different form. If you have a retirement account, um, if you have the right to access the funds in the retirement account, that counts as a resource, not as income. And when you pull money out of it, then that's not income unless you do something that's called annuitize the retirement account, where you convert it to an annuity and you only have the right to get the income. You no longer have the right to take the principal balance out. Then you would count the monthly payments under that annuity. Typically, it would be monthly payments as income. Um, Certainly, the most typical kind of income we see are, say, Social Security payments, VA payments, pension payments. Those would be what Medicaid calls unearned income, even though you had to work to get it. But at the time you're receiving it, it's not a direct payment for working. And so those are counted as unearned income. Medicaid, for really all of its programs, starts out looking at the gross on that income before any deductions for a Part B premium, or if you're having taxes withheld or health insurance, say out of a pension. Then for if say a senior or a disabled person is still working, then that's earned income. And there are some disregards to give incentives to people to continue to work and to take into account you have expenses when you're working. So typically, they have kind of an odd formula that they'll deduct $65 from the earnings and then divide that result in half to get countable earned income. Um, if a person is self-employed, then they would allow them to take off, say, their work expenses. If they're, let's say somebody was a carpenter and they did home repair, they did work in the home, the cost of their transportation, the cost of their supplies, you would deduct first, and then you would do the subtract 65 divided 2. But for somebody who's working for somebody getting paid, say an hourly rate, then Medicaid will use the gross earnings, then subtract 65, divide by 2 to get countable earned income. Then you add the unearned income and earned income together, and there can be, for most of the programs, they deduct the first $20. Don't count $20 of your income. But for somebody that only gets, say, Social Security, they would deduct $20. The rest of their income would count in reviewing their income.
Okay. So let me go back to the um, retirement accounts, whether it's an IRA or a 401k, some sort of investment and retirement investment. So I thought I heard you say that unless it was annuitized, which means you've set it up to give yourself monthly distributions, the income from that doesn't count? Or did I hear you wrong?
No, you heard me correctly. They should not be counting that as income. If you pull money out, and for instance, once you get to, of course, that age is going up. I think it's 72 and a half now, where you have to take minimum distributions. Even taking the minimum distributions out should not be counted as income. You're just pulling, that's really not any different than pulling money out of a savings account. You're just changing the form of it.
Right.
The other thing to remember is if you have, say, a younger person who's still working and under their employer rules, they're not allowed, if they're not allowed to pull the funds out, then it's not countable. If it's, if they can pull the funds out let's say you have a spouse, your spouse is applying and the other spouse is maybe younger and still working. If you can pull the funds out, but subject to a penalty, the amount that you would get after the penalty is still countable. There was a significant change last year also with respect to retirement accounts. And here we get into kind of the spousal impoverishment rules. There are special rules that apply to protect what's referred to as the community spouse when you have the situation of one spouse in a nursing home, the other spouse not in the nursing home referred to as community spouse, or you also have what's an alternative to being institutionalized, the Medicaid waiver services. And you'll probably ask me some more about waiver services. So up until July of last year, the retirement account of a community spouse who was not seeking Medicaid was not counted when determining the eligibility of the institutionalized spouse. But starting for applications on or after July 26th, 2024, Indiana is now counting the retirement accounts also of the community spouse. There's still a higher resource limit, a certain amount of resources, assets that are protected for the community spouse, but in determining their share, the community spouse's retirement accounts are no longer exempt. So that's been a significant change in Indiana.
Right. That can be very impactful to a lot of people.
Right,
Um,
because the community spouse then either, needs to consider, do they need to annuitize their account or do they need to pull their funds out to support the institutionalized spouse? And then potentially there's tax consequences to that too.
oh, for sure. So if you annuitize a retirement investment account, and that means that you're receiving monthly distributions, regular monthly distributions, then does that retirement account count towards your resource limit?
So if you annuitize it in a way that's often referred to as irrevocable, you can no longer access the principal amount, then it it does not count as a resource anymore. You've basically, sometimes it's referred to as you've converted a resource into a stream of income. Now, when you do that, there are a set of rules that apply to that. Basically, they want even payments. They don't want a balloon payment. It would have to be set up so that it would draw down, it would pay back at least the principal amount within the person's life expectancy using a life expectancy table. And Medicaid is going to want to be listed as a contingent beneficiary to pay back Medicaid if you were to die before all the pay, if there are guaranteed payments under it and you die before all the payments are made back. So,
Right. Okay. So, speaking of Medicaid getting paid back, let's talk about clients that Megan and I meet a lot that don't want to apply for any kind of Medicaid because they don't want Medicaid to take their house because they most often it's their only asset and they want to leave it to their children. So tell us how that how the state becomes real estate agents and takes folks' houses and under what programs do they not?
okay. So you're referring to a program called Estate Recovery that is in the federal law and it applies to Medicaid, well, many forms of Medicaid assistance paid after age 55. Couple of things to remember. One is it does not apply to, when you apply Medicaid's not going to come in during your lifetime and take your property. So the house, this estate recovery only comes up at death. Now, there may be, we talked about there could be limits on resources and the home, as long as the person or their spouse or a dependent child's living in it is exempt. So Medicaid wouldn't force that sale. But there are some assets, if you had money in the bank that was too high to qualify, you'd have to spend that down. You don't have to pay it to Medicaid, though. Um, there are some programs that are exempt from estate recovery, and those programs generally are referred to as the Medicare savings programs. The programs that the payments for Part B premiums under uh, programs when the state pays, typically when a person becomes eligible for Medicaid, and they have Medicare also, because a person can be eligible for both Medicaid and Medicare. That's commonly referred to as being a dual eligible. Um, then the state of Indiana will pay that person's Part B premium. The payments for Part B premiums are not recoverable under a state recovery. There is also a very helpful Medicare savings program referred to as QMB, or Qualified Medicare Beneficiary. And under that program, for people eligible for QMB, it has a higher income limit, 150% of the federal poverty level. It has a higher resource limit than the typical full Medicaid program. And under that program, not only does the state of Indiana pay the Part B premiums, it also pays for any Medicare covered service. It will pay the copay and the deductible that Medicare doesn't pay, and Indiana says it will not do a state recovery of payments under the QMB program. Now, a person, it can get complicated because a person can have full Medicaid and QMB, both, if you meet the criteria for both. For instance, a person who is, let's say they're in a nursing home, but their income is under 150% of poverty level. So any Medicare covered services would be covered by Medicaid QMB. The payment for the per diem cost of being in the nursing home would then be covered by the full Medicaid. At death, that person would be subject to a state recovery, and probably the amount they paid under the nursing home would dwarf the amount paid under QMB. But if it's a situation where they've received full Medicaid and QMB, payments under QMB should not be recoverable in a state recovery. There also are exceptions under a state recovery if a person is survived by a spouse or a disabled child who's dependent upon them, then that property should be protected for that dependent. There's also some language that one can apply for something called a hardship exception if the heirs who are receiving the property, if they don't receive that property, if they're going to have to receive public assistance themselves, um, one can seek a hardship exception from a state recovery. And then even in those situations where the state has the right to do a state recovery after death, it's actually pretty inconsistent in doing so. Indiana law now actually provides that the state has to file a claim against the estate within 120 days of death. And so if the family isn't opening an estate within 120 days, then the burden's on the state to open the estate within 120 days to recover. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. So
So it's a roll of the dice for sure.
it is a roll of the dice. And then, particularly in some cases, even where a state recovery applies. One of the things we'll tell our clients is that, this if that person received Medicaid, the state is then recovering the amount that it paid out under Medicaid, not, what the private pay rate um, of that would be. So sometimes that's even a savings, even if there is a state recovery, that might be less. It's gotten a little more complicated now with managed care because Medicaid is using managed care for some of the categories. You'll see pathways, and the person has to choose a managed care provider. Healthy Indiana plan that because the state recovery would apply to somebody receiving HIP benefits over age 55. Um, if a person's in a managed care plan, the state pays that managed care entity a monthly amount referred to as a capitated payment. And so when it comes to a state recovery, let's say that person was on HIP after age 55, but was pretty healthy and really never utilized it and was not thinking there'd be anything that would be owed back. The state would say, well, we're still paying the managed care entity a monthly amount. That's the amount they would be looking at for a state recovery for somebody who's receiving their Medicaid assistance through a managed care program.
I had not thought about estate recovery and how managed care pathways works. Wow.
And it could work, the other way. Somebody might have catastrophic expenses, be in the hospital for months and months and months, and then, the estate recovery would just be the monthly capitated payment because the managed care entity is averaging out. I mean, they're getting an average payment per person, and some cost less and some cost more.
Right, right. So, is there a rule that, say, the asset is the home, and the person who had received Medicaid services, Medicaid benefits, passes away, but they had a caregiver in that home? Is there still the 2-year caregiver can live in your home rule?
So they're so here we're talking about this ties into transfer penalties. So Medicaid says if a person has, and it's really not any caregiver, it has to be an adult son or daughter. If that person's adult son or daughter lived with them for at least 2 years before they were institutionalized, then that parent can transfer the home to that son or daughter without having a penalty because Medicaid, and we can talk about transfer penalties, but Medicaid has rules trying to dissuade people from giving their assets away in order to meet the either to meet the resource limit or to avoid a state recovery. Um, but there are some exceptions. For instance, there's no penalty for transferring any amount of property to your disabled son or daughter. And then there is the caregiver exception, but one should consult an attorney who knows Medicaid if they're in that situation where that adult son or daughter is living in the home providing care. I mean, we've seen some situations where, sometimes the adult son or daughter lives next door or very close and comes over every day to provide care to keep that person at home. They're not living in the home. The caregiver exception requires that you actually be living in the home with that person receiving care for at least providing care for at least 2 years that helped avoid them being institutionalized.
Okay. Um, and along those lines, you talked about transfer of property. Um, I always caution people if they're just a little bit over the resource limit about, I don't tell them, I don't quote Medicaid rules to them, but I say generally, if you're making purchases to benefit you, then that's okay. Just make sure you keep every receipt. So I know you can't list them all, but generally speaking, when people are close to the resource limit, they meet income eligibility, but they really need Medicaid to get some various services. What kinds of things are typical for people to spend money on that Medicaid won't say, "Oh, you're giving your money away, you don't qualify."
Good question. So certainly paying bills that they legitimately owe. So if they have a credit card bill that they owe, medical bills that Medicaid won't go back and pick up that they owe. If they, let's say they're still living in the home and they have a mortgage, if they want to pay an extra amount on the mortgage, they can certainly do that. They can purchase items. Um, I would certainly recommend that they purchase items that they need. Technically, Medicaid shouldn't be second guessing what the person is, you know, purchasing on. But, the more, like you said, you want to keep receipts. Um, if it's being used for transportation for you, one vehicle of any value is exempt. So if you have somebody that's still able to live in the community and is still driving and has an unreliable vehicle, using funds to purchase a more reliable vehicle can be a good purchase. Um, Payment for funeral, burial, cremation that's set done through paid for irrevocably as long as it's done in ways that satisfy Medicaid. Typically, we refer people to work through a funeral home that knows the rules, but prepaying for a funeral plan, burial plan, cremation is acceptable. Medicaid now has rules that do say that prepaid plan must have language in it saying if there's excess funds left over, that goes to the state of Indiana or to your estate. They don't want there in the past there had been some people that had tried to game the situation by putting extra money into a funeral trust that really wouldn't be needed for the funeral with the idea that it would go to a family member, and Medicaid says no. If there's any money, and usually there's not money left over in those prepayment plans, but if there is, it needs to go to the state. And then if you're applying for Medicaid immediately, if you sign up for a prepaid plan with a funeral home, it should have language that says if you're applying for Medicaid, you do not have, normally you have a 30-day free look period under Indiana state law for those plans that you have 30 days to get out of the plan if you change your mind. But if you're applying for Medicaid and you don't want the money to count right away, um, then you can waive that 30-day free look. And that kind of ties in with most of the plans for Medicaid. Resources are measured on the first moment of the first day of the month. It's for administrative convenience. I tell my clients, particularly looking at your checking account, your money comes in, your checking account goes up, you pay bills, your checking account goes down, your checking account continues to do that month after month. For administrative convenience, for any of the programs that have a resource limit, Medicaid looks at the countable resources at the first moment of the first day of the month before any of the income for that month has come in. So for instance, if we're sitting here on August 25th, if we're talking to somebody who is a little bit over the limit and they're wanting Medicaid starting September 1, then I would tell them they have to get down below the resource limit by the end of the day on August 31st, have good records of that. And if they're buying a funeral trust between now and then, they would want to have, language in that funeral trust that says they waive the 30-day free look provision and that there's a payback to either their estate or the state of Indiana if there's excess funds in that trust account after their death.
Okay. Um, those are some good ideas. And again, we do not counsel people on the specifics about Medicaid, um, beyond a Medicare savings program and another program called Extra Help. And SHIP does stand ready to help people do those applications. So just thought I would put our own commercial in there.
Very good.
Okay, so we're talking about assets. I must ask, how is farmland considered?
So Indiana has a provision that's different than many other states that does say that any real estate that is producing income is exempt. So first of all, we kind of start out with the home is exempt. And Indiana actually does define the home as being any land that's contiguous with the home. So if somebody still lives on the farm homestead and has farmland around it, that farmland should actually be exempt as the homestead. But let's say they no longer live there. If the farm is still producing income, and hopefully it will be producing net positive income after expenses, then it is it is exempt. And then if a person has real estate, whether it's farmland or other real estate that is not exempt, let's say it's not their home, it is not producing income. Let's say they had a vacation um, a vacation plot at a lake in northern Indiana where they would go to, and they don't rent it out. It's just, it was for their use. And they're applying for Medicaid. It's not producing income. They own it. Medicaid would say, as a condition of receiving Medicaid, you would have to offer that real estate for sale or rent at fair market value. You would not actually be denied Medicaid because you own the real estate, but you would be required to make a good faith effort to either rent it or sell it. If you rented it, then the income on it would be counted as your income in the calculations going forward. If you sold it, then the proceeds, you would either look at, are there some planning you could do with the proceeds you would receive, or if you didn't do that, then the proceeds could potentially make you ineligible for the month after you received them.
Right. So, with the farm question, I do meet people who are owners of the farm, but now their five children are owners as well. So would they just take 1/6 of um, the value and the income from the farm, assuming it's net positive?
Right. I mean, if they were a 1/6 owner, then that would be the case. Yes, they would be a 1/6 owner. And, one thing I would look at in that was, when did that occur? Because Medicaid has, we talked a little bit about transfer of asset rules when a person applies for Medicaid. And actually, it really is when a person is seeking Medicaid to pay for either institutional care or waiver services, which are seen as an alternative to institutional, or I'm really referring to care in a nursing home. Medicaid will look at, were there transfers of assets within the prior 5 years? There's a 5-year look back period. So if they say, put the 5 children, if they transferred, if it was set up more than 5 years ago that they owned it with the 5 children, then that would not be an issue. Let's say 3 years ago, they transferred, it was their farm by themselves, and they added their 5 children on. And let's say their children didn't pay anything for that. And let's say maybe they weren't even helping on the farm. They were just wanted the 5 children to be on there, then Medicaid would generally look at that as if they had gifted away 5/6 of the value of the home. So that
Okay.
could result in a transfer penalty.
All right. And then they would just have to wait the 5 years out before they could get Medicaid until the look back would be expired.
So options would include, I mean, a key there would be you would not want to apply for Medicaid if there were a transfer that would result in a transfer penalty. And you're right. One option would be if they were able to wait until more than 5 years after that transfer before they applied for Medicaid, they could do that. Medicaid would also, of course, with 5 children, it might be harder, but if the 5 children transferred their 5/6 back to the parent so that now the parent is again the sole owner, then that would remove any transfer penalty. So you can remove a transfer penalty if they'll give it back. And sometimes that works. Sometimes particularly if it's money that's been given, oftentimes that money's been spent and they don't have it to give back.
Mhm. Right. That's why I think general counsel is don't be giving away a bunch of money and then try to get Medicaid.
Well, and what I try to counsel people is, right, don't give it away unless you have enough to meet your needs for the next 5 years. And it's hard to know what your needs will be for the next 5 years. But, a lot of times people are thinking in terms of helping their family members or somebody and not really thinking about potentially needing Medicaid. There are some exceptions if you can show that, the transfer was made solely for reasons other than to qualify for Medicaid, then that's an exemption from a transfer penalty. Again, gifts to family members may be hard to fit into that. The thing now is console people about, let's say sometimes you run into situations where the kids are, there's a very informal, kids are helping out the parents. They know the parents plan to leave the property to the kids, but there's no formal agreement. Medicaid now wants if you have children that are providing care, you can do a caregiver agreement and pay for services at a fair rate as the services are provided. And even in those situations, then Medicaid is going to want the caregiver to be keeping a log showing what services were actually provided so that they don't come in later and then they'll question whether services were provided. So again, that would be a situation. I would recommend that person consult an attorney knowledgeable about Medicaid, have a formal, if that's really what's going on, if the child is providing care and they want to compensate that child, have a formal caregiver agreement. There are some IRS rules that can come into play depending on how much, at a certain level, then, you know, payroll taxes should be paid. So consult consult somebody knowledgeable there, but that's something that is used in some situations.
Right. So another thing that we know that's used by many families is something called a Miller Trust. So give us the skinny on the Miller Trust.
Ah, yes. So the Miller Trust. So that comes up when you have a person that's in a nursing home or entering a nursing home. So the simplest situation is when they're in a nursing home and for technical reasons, there's an income limit, which this year is $2,901 a month. But we know that nursing homes are so expensive that even a person might have a healthy Social Security and a pension. Let's say their income is $4,000 a month. That still isn't going to cut it to pay privately for nursing home care, which often run potentially $10,000 a month, possibly more for private pay. But for technical reasons, there's this income. It's really not an income limit, but Indiana refers to it as special income level. And so the way I explain it to my clients is there was a person named Miller in the state of Colorado that was subject to this income test, and he sued the state and said, because his attorney came up with this idea of putting some of his income into a trust. And he sued the state because the state said, no, you can't do that. And the federal judge saw how arbitrary the income limit was and said, yes, you can put your money into a trust. And unfortunately, our Congress, rather than either eliminating the income limit or raising the income limit to a high enough amount so it could be workable, said, okay, we're going to let people in any state use this kind of trust. So it's commonly referred to as a Miller Trust. The more technical name is Qualified Income Trust. So it only applies to persons who have income above the special income limit. So it applies to a person in a nursing home or for something called Medicaid waiver services and those programs that are alternatives to nursing home care. So if, if a person has gross income above that special income level, then they have to at least be putting the amount of their gross income that exceeds that special income level into a Miller Trust account. You have to name a trustee. Typically, it's a family member, but it could be anybody willing to help manage the funds, and then that person can pass the income eligibility test. But then that money has to be put into that Miller Trust every month. And I describe it to my clients as it's an obstacle. You're jumping through hoops to qualify for Medicaid. And so let me give you an example. Let's say you had this year a person in a nursing home with 3,000 a month gross income. The special income level's 2,901 a month. So they would have to have a Miller Trust in which they're putting at least $99 a month into that trust to pass the income eligibility trust. But then once they're approved for Medicaid, if they don't qualify for any other deductions, let's say they don't have a Medicare supplement premium they're paying, then once they're approved for Medicaid, they have $3,000 a month income. They get to keep $52 for their personal needs, which is not enough really for most people in a nursing home. And then Medicaid will say they have to pay $29.48 a month to the nursing home out of their income, and Medicaid will pay the difference. So that money going into the Miller Trust, so they can put the $99 into the Miller Trust and then pay that over to the nursing home and pay more money to the nursing home, or they could decide to just put $29.48 into the Miller Trust each month and then take that money out of the Miller Trust and pay it to the nursing home each month. So it doesn't make sense when you talk about it, but I tell people you just have to do it to qualify for Medicaid.
Right. It does seem a bit
You
of a shuffle.
cannot use it to shelter resources. So that person you asked me about earlier, they had too much money to qualify. They can't take assets. They can only make deposits into the Miller Trust out of their monthly income.
And then when that person passes away, what happens to the balance of the Miller Trust?
So the Miller Trust has to have language that says at death, any amount remaining in the Miller Trust goes to the state of Indiana up to the amount they paid out for Medicaid. And if that person received Medicaid, then typically that means whatever's left in that Miller Trust will go to the state of Indiana. That example that I gave about the person in the nursing home, typically that money going into the Miller Trust, usually you're going to have to pay it to the nursing home, and you're only going to be leaving enough in the Miller Trust to keep it as an active account, depending on what the bank says you have to have in it. I've had clients that had as low as $1 in it. Um, and but there are some situations where funds in the Miller Trust can build up for some reason. Let's say that person who was on Medicaid went into, let's say they were on Medicaid and they have Medicare, and let's say they had to go into the hospital for an inpatient stay. They were there for over 3 days. When they go back into the nursing home, they qualify for a Medicare covered stay. And let's say they have a Medicare supplement, and let's say Medicare and the supplement pays for 100 days. Medicaid's really not paying during that time. So they don't have to pay their liability. That's the share the person pays to the nursing home each month is referred to as their liability. So they might have 2, 3 months where that money has built up in the Miller Trust. And, I would tell that person they could use those funds for other needs that that individual has that's not covered by Medicaid. Um, you know, pay for an outing, pay for clothes, pay for things. Um, but if that money is in that trust account when they die, then it's owed to the state of Indiana.
Right. I see Miller Trust as being very helpful for people who are residing in their community, receiving services through the Medicaid waiver more than a nursing home resident. That's just my experience.
Yeah,
So,
and those funds then can be used to kind of help them in their home and pay for other
right,
things potentially.
right. We only have a few minutes left. So just really quickly, where do you go to set up a Miller Trust?
So there is you can consult an attorney that deals with Medicaid. There is also a template form that's on FSSA's website. And then we have kind of a modified version of that we send out to our clients, people that contact us.
Okay, terrific. Well, I wish we had more time, but we're nearing our hour. And we do have one question in the chat. Well, we had a couple. Megan addressed one, and Megan has a question in the chat. And then we're going to thank you profusely for your time and your knowledge and your willingness to share with us and our listeners and all the work you do at the Senior Law Project. It's an amazing resource that we have here in Central Indiana. So,
Thank you.
Megan,
Yes.
what's the question?
All right. So the question is more so for us with SHIP than for Dennis. Um, Melissa had asked if she would qualify for Medicaid based on income. She didn't share her resources, but Dennis, you pretty much already answered that. And then I followed up with giving her a rough estimate of income and resources and encouraged her to call us at SHIP so we could go over her specific situation and help her apply. Well, Melissa's question then for us was, does SHIP charge for our assistance? And that answer is no, we are free and impartial. So the impartial part goes with our Medicare assistance primarily. We can do mostly everything an insurance agent does, but we're impartial. We're not insurance agents, and we don't recommend insurance companies. And then we're free. We do all of our Medicare assistance for free and our help with Medicaid applications. So, Melissa, give us a call at that number that I listed, and we will be happy to help you.
And for
Okay.
those persons that we assist through the Senior Law Project or that Indiana Legal Services assists, there's no charge for our services either.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Dennis. Good point.
Yes, and that's because we are funded by the government, mostly federal, all federal in our situation, and we're supported by the Indiana Department of Insurance. So, okay, Dennis, thanks again. And Megan is going to tell us what's coming up.
Yes, thank you, Susan, and thank you too, Dennis. Wonderful information. So in September, I can't believe it's September already, we have 3 wonderful lives. Our first one is on September the 8th. We are going to invite one of our SHIP partners to join us to talk about what they do at their agency with other resources besides SHIP and talk about their experience with SHIP. And then our What to Know Wednesday on September the 10th is a presentation on Advantage plans and Medigap supplement plans. So we're going to talk about the difference between these two types of Medicare and what they do, what they don't do, all that good stuff. So as we're gearing up for fall open enrollment, that's a great presentation to watch because it kind of help you as we go in to that period, what you may want to do. And then we're going to wrap up the month on the 22nd with Medicare junk mail. So we're about ready to have our mailboxes full of Medicare mail. Some of it you do need to open, some of it you do need to keep. But a large amount you do not need to. You can just pitch it. And we're going to walk you through all the ins and outs of what you should keep and what you can pitch. And that's what we got going on in September.
All right. Thanks, Megan.
Welcome.
And another thanks to Dennis for joining us and for Megan for monitoring the chat and everybody who watched. Remember, this will stay on Facebook for 30 days and it will be on our YouTube channel within about a week or so. So if you have any questions about Medicaid, if you're on Medicare, you can also interact with us on our Facebook page and we will get back with you with your answers. So without further ado, we'll say have a terrific day and thanks for joining us. We'll see you in September.
Bye, everyone.